Before life, before the cosmic dust of creation coalesced into the magma cores around which planets would cool and form. At the moment of the galaxy's first beat of existence, there was the Catan. Shaped from the very energy unleashed from the galactic dawn of time itself. Stories and myths would emerge billions of years later, recounting the tales of these malevolent beings and their role in changing the course of the universe. But in their primordial form, they were far from the stain their future held. They were simply a parasitic energy, wrapping themselves around and drinking from the very same stars birthed alongside them. Eons would pass, and the Catan would learn to traverse along the lines of electromagnetic flux that stretched the universe, to find new feeding grounds, ignorant of the solid matter that began permeating galaxies with life. For now, the Catan would remain unaware of life flourishing within the galaxy. For when their attention was diverted, world after world would burn. Just as the universe and the galaxies within spun to life, so too did the galaxies contain life of their own. In our home galaxy, the Milky Way, there was an ancient species known as the Old Ones, extremely potent with psychic abilities and seemingly immortal. This species was known for its slow and cold-blooded wisdom and intelligence, and was thought to be both reptilian in nature and the first species in our galaxy to become fully self-aware. Through their advanced intellect and technology, alongside their psychic prowess, the Old Ones held sway over both the materium and the immaterium. And with this mastery, they created what would eventually be known as the Webway, a labyrinth dimension that sits between the warp and real space, often interpreted as a large tangled network of doors known as warp gates, each of which connects fixed points within the materium, which allowed the Old Ones to navigate to essentially anywhere in the galaxy in a single step. The Old Ones used their advanced technology and understanding to help nurture the much younger races of the galaxy, even going as far to seed life across many worlds themselves. Notably, among these seeded races would be the Eldari, the Krorks, who would eventually evolve into orcs, and potentially even primitive humanity upon Terra. But to suggest such an idea within the Imperium of Man would be nothing short of heresy. To the Old Ones, life was precious, and in their benevolent wisdom, they sought to foster the myriad races across the galaxy. The Old Ones reached the pinnacle of their technology and civilization over 60 million years ago. But growing even more technologically advanced alongside them was a humanoid race known as the Necrontyr. And the relationship between these two races would forever change the course of galaxy and universe alike. In the dark corner of the galaxy, known as the Halo Stars region, billions of years ago, there lived, under a harsh and unforgiving star, the Necrontyr. A morbid people, the Necrontyr lived precariously short lives, their flesh and blood poisoned and diseased by incessant solar winds and radiation storms. To them, life was but a brief blip lived in anticipation of a shortly coming and more permanent death, and their culture and cities reflected this. Grand sepulchres and tomb complexes bathed their civilization in shadow. Monuments to honor the dead, never the living. This was the truth of the Necrontyr. no dynasty immune to its irradiated touch. As such, driven by instinct and necessity, the Necrontyr needed to leave their homeworld behind them, to spread amongst the stars, free from the damning energies of their birth star. Their technological advancement created this opportunity for them. They created slow-moving, antimatter-powered torch ships, made from a living metal known as necrodermis, which had the ability to repair itself of almost any damage done to it. In these ships, they rested within stasis crypts to ensure that the millennia's long travel would not see their life long over before their exodus concluded. And little by little, Necrontyr dynasties spread out across the galaxy, colonizing worlds, until much of the ancient galaxy answered to their rule. While many different Necrontyr dynasties ruled over many different worlds over the galaxy, the race as a whole was still unified and governed by the Triarch, a council which comprised 3 of the most powerful dynasty's monarchs known as Pharaons. The head of the Triarch was known simply as the Silent King, for his words were addressed to his subjects through the 2 additional Pharaons who governed along with him. It was sometime during the Necrontyr's slow expansion through the galaxy that they encountered the Old Ones. While the Necrontyr were arguably more technologically advanced, the Old Ones possessed 2 things they did not: the ability to use and conceive the immaterium and the psychic powers drawn from it to bolster their lives and technology, and the secrets to immortality. Despite their exodus from their homeworld, the Necrontyr still bore the irradiated curse of their birth star, and the Old Ones' mastery of immortality and their disinclination to share it with them kindled a burning, jealous rage within the hearts of the Necrontyr, which would eat away at their spirits as much as the cancers ate at their flesh. Time would go on for the Necrontyr, but as it did, more strife would find its way to them. As their interstellar territory grew ever larger and ever more diverse, the unity forged between the dynasties and the race, the very thing that made them strong, began to corrode, and war erupted in its place. Each dynasty hoped to carve out its own destiny, its own place in the wider galaxy, and so the great houses clashed against one another. While the Necrontyr were plagued with a shorter lifespan, that did nothing to shorten the list of grudges, rivals, or simple petty jealousy, political or otherwise, that they clung tightly to. The wars of secession raged across the Necrontyr Empire. The Triarch reasoned that should action not be taken, and should circumstances of this war remain, it wouldn't be long before their race would wipe themselves from the galaxy, suffering the same fate many unknown and unnamed races had before them and will continue to do after they're gone. This Triarch, under the reign of the last of the Silent Kings, Zarek, sought to bring commonality to their people once more. To this end, they brought a common hatred to the forefront and declared the Necrontyr to war against the Old Ones. Zarek pledged to his people that should the Old Ones not willingly share the secrets of their immortality with them, then the Necrontyr would litter the galaxy with their ashes and take it from them. For the war effort, the Silent King offered amnesty to the secessionist dynasties that laid their feuds down and returned to the fold to fight side by side rather than against their fellow Necrontyr. The Silent King's ploy worked. The wars of secession came to an abrupt stop. The Necrontyr dynasties pledging themselves to the war effort and to the spoils of a victory that promised immortality. In an instant, Zarek set in motion a conflict that would see the galaxy itself tremble, a war that would span the heavens. He was successful in uniting his people in their hate, and sent them, blinded by this hate, to march into a war they could not win. The wars that followed the Silent King's gambit of unity for his people would later be known in Eldari myth as the War in Heaven. It is said that the history and accounts of this war would fill an entire library in its own right. But while most of this information has been lost to time, many facts still persist. The Necrontyr took to the stars, their engines thrumming to the sound of war, to fight for an end to their curse, for immortality. Though their technology was superior to that of the Old Ones, their downfall would come from their enemies' mastery of the webway and warp gates. The Old Ones outmaneuvered the Necrontyr at every turn, disrupting supply lines, cutting off reinforcements, constantly destabilizing the Necrontyr and their Triarch's war plans. So overwhelming was the Old Ones' use of the webway that the Necrontyr were pushed further and further back, until they were forced to their irradiated homeworld, left as a speck of an annoyance at the far reaches of the galaxy, where they would cling to their hatred alone and out of sight, under the accursed gaze of their birth star. This defeat fractured the Necrontyr more than ever before. Exiled and forgotten on their cruel homeworld plagued their pride and their mind, just as the sun plagued their flesh and their blood. They developed a seething hatred for all intelligent life in the universe, and determined themselves to avenge their defeat upon their enemies. Yet, this rage would be tempered by millennia-long imprisonment. It would never disappear from them entirely. However, the unity of the Necrontyr dynasties of a common enemy would soon dissipate. Generations of Necrontyr from houses both great and low had lived and died in the service of the Silent King's unwinnable war. And so that unity became more fractured than it ever had been before, and the second iteration of the Wars of Secession imploded the Necrontyr Empire. So ruinous were these wars that if the Old Ones had had the inclination to wipe the Necrontyr from existence, they could have. This act of ignorance, or perhaps benevolence, would be looked back upon as the deciding factor of the Old Ones' fall. Zarek and the Triarch became even more desperate than before. All around them, their people fought amongst themselves. Houses were snuffed out, dynasties collapsed. The existence of their race stood upon the precipice of dust and ash. The Triarch's frantic search for the means of restoring peace and order came as the clock's hand told the Necrontyr's final hour, and the price to be paid for it was everything. The Triarch faced an almost impossible dilemma: restore order or watch their race purge themselves from the galaxy. The call to war to face their common enemy was now irrelevant. They could not defeat the Old Ones on their own, and time was running short for the Necrontyr. But it was in their darkest hour that their prayers were answered, or so they believed. The dust-covered tomes and scrolls held within the library on the tomb world of Solemnance claim that by accident and sheer luck, a stellar probe made a discovery while investigating a dying star within the Halo Star region. as part of Necrontyr scientists' desperate attempts to understand the region's stars in hopes of protecting themselves from its plaguing touch. This discovery was that of an intelligent ethereal being made of energy, having wrapped itself around the nearby star and was feeding upon it. To the Necrontyr, this godlike being was the solution to their conundrum. These were their star gods, or Catan in their native language, who would free them from strife and give them the edge they needed to bring retribution to their hated enemy. They believed the Catan were the progeny of the death god they had long worshipped. These beings of immaculate energy, these stars made animate, were the weapon the Triarch had prayed for. How the Silent King made contact with these star gods is unknown, but contact was made nonetheless. Knowing that these ethereal beings of raw energy could not perceive the universe around them without the ability to manifest into the material form, the Necrontyr forged for them a physical shell made from their living metal necrodermis, so that the Catan might take physical form. The star vampires coiled into their new necrodermis bodies and perceived for the first time this new material existence. An existence they would come to appreciate, the pleasures of corporeal life, the delicious trickles of electromagnetic energy pouring off the physical bodies of the Necrontyr. A new hunger awoke within the Catan that day, but they were not so unwise as to begin feeding upon the Necrontyr in a frenzy. How much more life was out in the galaxy, they wondered. How could the Necrontyr be of assistance in understanding the new universe they were in? How could the Necrontyr be manipulated into being their forward army, heralding the arrival of their feast? So it was that one Catan came before the Silent King, the forerunner of his brothers to come. This was Mephitran, the Deceiver. Yet the Catan's nature was unknown to Zarak. The Deceiver spoke to the Silent King of an ancient feud, a war fought between the Catan and the Old Ones, far before the birth of the Necrontyr. A war, the Deceiver said, the Catan had lost, and in their defeat, in fear of the Old Ones, they hid themselves away in the darkest recesses of the galaxy, awaiting a time in which they found allies that could use to bring about vengeance. In a bid for alliance with the Silent King, the Deceiver assured him that everything the Necrontyr had craved would be theirs: retribution, unity, and immortality. These gifts and more to be given to them by the Catan at no cost, for these were to be boons for their valued allies. How much of these words were true, not even the Deceiver could know. Nonetheless, these words held great sway over Zarak. For many months, he discussed the matter with the other Pharaons of the Triarch, as well as with the nobles of his royal court. Through all of it, the only voice of protest was that of Oricons, the court astrologer. He prophesied that the alliance between Necrontyr and Catan would come to bear a renaissance of glory and the victory they so desired, but that its price would forever destroy the soul of their people. The caution of the Silent King was quickly made invalid by desire and ambition, and Oricon's prophecy was dismissed. 1 year after the Deceiver first met with Zarak and made his offer, the Silent King accepted, in doing so, forever dooming his people. The drums of war sounded once more, armed with weapons of godlike power and a new quantum phase technology that could surge their starships across the galaxy in an instant. The Necrontyr were eager to let loose their hatred upon the old ones, but the Catan had one last gift for their new allies, a path to immortality, an end to living in their diseased flesh, replaced by bodies made up of necrodermis, just like the bodies the Catan inhabited. Metal forms that could repair and replenish themselves, allowing them to pursue the old ones until the very last, while being free from death. Thus began the Great Biotransference. Great biofoundries were constructed, and into the constructs, the Silent King and the Necrontyr people marched. While we can't know what blasphemous procedures the Necrontyr were exposed to within, we do know that each was stripped of both their flesh and their soul, and their body replaced by a shell of living metal, animated by whatever remained of their conscious guttering selves. As Zarek himself emerged from the biofoundry, he watched as above each furnace the ethereal forms of the Catan feasted and glutted themselves upon both the spiritual and electromagnetic remnants of an entire race. It was only then that he saw the twisted and awful truth of the pact he had made. While in myriad ways, he felt better physically than he ever had. The strength and vigor of a god were now his. Thoughts that were clear, and a mind of deep and unforgetting intelligence. A body encased in living alloy and eternal. Yet for all of that, there would be a constant gnawing at his and all of the Necrontyr's minds, an inexpressible hollow, the absence of spirit. For the price to be paid was the souls of an entire people. Even though the price was steep, the Catan's promise had been fulfilled. Life eternal was theirs, from the highest among them to the lowest. Their cursed sun could do little to rust and erode their new mechanical bodies, and only the most destructive and complete of injuries could destroy them fully. The process of biotransference had also embedded an engrammatic command protocol in each of the Necrons' minds, which granted the Silent King the unyielding, unswerving loyalty of his subjects. Zarek at first embraced this welcome reprieve of guaranteed unity and an end to the fractiousness of their race. But as time would pass, Zarek would become weary of this burden and lonely. But, in fear of what his people would do to him for visiting the curse of soullessness upon them, he dared not to sever the command protocol. Biotransference left nothing behind but the ghostly echoes of the Necrontyr's consciousnesses. Only the most intelligent and strong-willed of their people retained their intellect as well as their self-awareness, albeit as shadows of who they once were. Only one thing remained as a collective amongst them: their hatred for all living and intelligent species across the galaxy. Now, with both the Catan and the Necrontyr empowered as never before, they took that rage to the heavens to leave a trail of broken and burning stars and worlds in their wake. The short-lived, cancer-addled Necrontyr walked into the foundries that day, and the soulless, undying Necrons marched out. Legions of the undying Necrons set out into the galaxy aboard their tomb ships, reignited as ever before in their hatred of the old ones. The Catan's mastery over the physical universe would see the Old Ones countered in their use of the webway, and where they once could outmaneuver the necrons, now they were simply doomed. The feast of necrontyr souls had empowered the Catan beyond comprehension. They razed entire planets, extinguished suns without a thought, even conjured black holes to consume entire star systems. The star gods and their legions of undying warriors were nigh on unstoppable in their slaughter-filled conquest across the Milky Way. The war in heaven is reignited in full. With the aid of the Catan known as Nyadrazath, the Burning One, the Necrons were able to construct portal gates of living stone known as Dolmen Gates, which allowed them to enter the webway. With the webway breached, the Necrons assaulted the Old Ones at every corner of the galaxy. However, it was not just the Old Ones who felt the calculated sting of the Necrons' wrath. So too did the undying machines lay siege to the colonies and strongholds of other younger and intelligent species, leading their Catan masters into feeding frenzy after feeding frenzy. In the wake of unending victories, they now dominated the galaxy, as the last of the Old Ones' planetary citadels were besieged. A race that once nurtured life across the galaxy had become merely more than livestock for the incessant hunger of the Catan. But there was still a sliver of hope for these ancient peoples. For reasons unknown, the Catan began to fight amongst themselves. Some suggest it was merely for sport or out of spite. Others say their hunger simply knew no bounds. And Eldari myth says that it was their laughing god that tricked the Catan known as the Outsider into turning against his brothers in a bid for ascendancy, which sparked a civil war. Even as Catan fought against Catan, whole worlds and solar systems were the casualties of this conflict, and the galaxy continued to suffer. It came to a point where the Old Ones, known and defined by the patience and unbreakable will, became desperate in the wake of the Necrons' assault and the galaxy-shaking inner conflict of the star gods. With their grand intellect and mastery of both science and the warp, they sought to genetically engineer an intelligent species with an even stronger psychic link to the warp, in hopes that they would be able to channel this psychic power in a way that would turn the tides of the war. In doing so, they nurtured many more potential warrior species, chief amongst these being the Eldari. The war in heaven raged on. Millennia passed before the fruits of the Old Ones' creations came to be, even while the Necron continued to extinguish life across the galaxy and push the Old Ones back even closer to the brink of extinction. Now, with the Eldari nearing the height of their power, they clashed with the Necron and Catan forces. The psychic power of the Eldari's warp magic decimated the legions of the undying machines, and now it was the Necrons that were being driven back yet again, as the magical forces of the Immaterium were anathema to the soulless metal constructs whose entire existence was wholly contained as an electromagnetic force. For all the destructive and technological powers the Necron could muster, it could not stop the Eldari's psychic advance against them, and the Catan's empire began to shatter. For the first time in millions of years, the Catan became unified in the face of this psychic threat, seeking a way to defeat the powers of the Immaterium. Their plan was to construct a great warding, one that would seal the material universe completely off from the warp, a plan of which its first steps could be found upon the world of Cadia, in the form of great pylons that dotted the planet's surface. It wouldn't be long before the Catan would succeed. But before their plan could come to fruition, the seeds of destruction planted by the Old Ones in their desperate attempt to stop the Necron advance brought about an unforeseen cataclysm. The grand psychic powers of the Eldari, paired with the growing pains of a young race and the psychic flaws of their collective, threw the immaterium into chaos, as it were. Destruction, pain, war, all mirrored from the Eldari into the fathomless depths of the warp, as the Sea of Souls became a maelstrom of energy. Older entities that had long existed in the warp became disfigured and transformed into awful and terrifying psychic predators who tore at the fabric of reality to pull themselves from the immaterium and devour the souls of countless beings across the galaxy. The warp was disfigured beyond recognition, torn apart and reformed into the realm of chaos. Frenzied by the voracious use of psychic activity raging across the materium, the denizens of the warp were forever changed. They gathered in mass at the cracks between the immaterium and the materium, desperate and eager to enter the material realm. Just as the tides of war were changing in their favor, the Old Ones were faced with a new and overwhelming threat to their dwindling empire. Despite the new genetically engineered warrior species they brought into the fold to defend their last bastions, namely the technology-mimicking Jokero and the green-skinned Krork, it was simply too late. The webway was breached by the creatures of the warp, and the Old Ones were forced to destroy several of their warp gates, just to prevent the entities from the immaterium from spreading to more uncorrupted worlds. The webway was now lost to the Old Ones, and the horror spilling into real space which would consume them and all life in the galaxy was a direct consequence of their own making. The most horrific of these warp entities were the enslavers, who had the ability to completely dominate the mind of the younger species, using them to create their own portals into the materium. And if it were one of the myriad of psychers that dotted the galaxy, they were brought into real space by even greater numbers. The Old Ones had opened Pandora's box in their desperation to halt the Necrons' burning advance across the galaxy. Life stood defiant upon the precipice of apocalypse and extinction during the war in heaven. But now, as the enslaver plague was unleashed into the universe, the survivors appeared only to be doomed. This was the final disaster for the Old Ones, their civilization and strongholds destroyed and overrun, the young races they nourished possessed and bringing uncountable cosmic horrors into the galaxy. They had little hope of winning a war on two fronts. Their webway lost to them, their reign and time in the galaxy was over. Whether the Old Ones were brought to an inevitable extinction, scattered and destroyed, or they simply fled the Milky Way to find a new haven in the undiscovered reaches of the universe, is unknown. All throughout the latter half of the War in Heaven, Zarek the Silent King bided his time, awaiting the moment of his grand betrayal. Even with the command and power of the entirety of the Necrons' legions, he couldn't have hoped to oppose the Catan at the height of their power. He watched, waited, and he hated them for everything they took from the Necrontyr in their deception. But as the war in heaven raged on, and Catan would turn against Catan, and the Old One's Psyker races would also weaken their advance. Zarek's time was drawing near. Then, at the apex of the Enslaver Plague, their ancient hated enemy was defeated, and the Catan were spent from their long and hard-fought victory. It was only then that the Silent King revealed his pointed gun, and even in their arrogance, the Catan wouldn't see the smoking barrel until it was too late. Under Zarek's order, the finest cryptex of the necrons had constructed god-killing hypercannons capable of focusing the unimaginable energies of the living universe. A blast so intense that not even the Catan could withstand the wrath of this impossibly powerful weapon. Even now, the greatest and most intelligent overlords of the Necrons barely remember the battle against their star gods, as causality itself was maimed by the destructive energies required to dismantle the Catan. The Silent King, as well, was sure to remove the knowledge of such weapons from his subjects, in fear of what could later be done with them if their existence was known. However, the Catan were immortal spawns of the stars, and part of the fundamental fabric of reality, and so their complete annihilation was impossible. But this wasn't unknown to Zarek, and so he planned accordingly. Instead of their total destruction, the Catan were sundered into thousands of smaller and less powerful fragments, each fragment retaining the personality of the Catan as a whole. The fragments were all each bound within a multi-dimensional tesseract labyrinth, imprisoned for eternity. The cost of dealing with the Catan was once more steep. Millions more necrons were destroyed in their rebellion, including all the members of the Triarch besides the Silent King. Alas, victory was theirs, and with it, the freedom to command their own destiny. Victory against both their ancient hatreds and their godly oppressors belonged to the Necrons. But the consequences of all the galaxy's actions from then until now was still a galaxy on fire, and a war against the violent powers of the Eldari Psykers that the Silent King knew they could not win. The Eldari had survived where the Old Ones had not, and he knew that galactic dominion belonged to them for now, and that the Necrons' time in the galaxy was at an end, at least for an age. Yet he knew that this enemy would as well succumb to extinction, as it must for all beings still made of flesh, even if it took millions of years. So, the Silent King ordered that the remaining of the Necron cities be converted into grand tomb complexes filled with stasis crypts. Let the Eldari control the galaxy for a time. They were but ephemeral, and the Necron were undying and eternal. And thus did the Silent King command his final order: to sleep. Sleep a great sleep, for the equivalent of 60 million standard years. And when that 60 million years is up, awaken and rebuild all that they had lost. Restore the great Necrontyr dynasties in all their former glory. As the last Necrons laid into their stasis crypts for their great sleep, and the last of the tomb worlds was sealed in their subterranean vaults, Zarek destroyed the engrammatic command protocols that had allowed him to control his people for so long. For in his mind, he had completely and utterly failed them. And, without so much as a glance backwards, the last of the Silent Kings took his ship into the starless black void of intergalactic space to find whatever penance or solace he could find. Eons have passed, and the necrons sleep on, their machine constructs guarding the tomb worlds during their slumber, awaiting the Great Awakening in a galaxy ripe for conquest. But many of these tomb worlds would fall to misfortune and disruption. Most were minor inconveniences, but for others the effects were far more calamitous. Some destroyed in retribution by Eldari forces. Some stars went supernova, consuming worlds the necrons slumbered upon. Tectonic shifts in other planets crushed the tomb complexes in their sleep. Their Great Awakening had been anything but precise. They have not risen as a singular people, but in intermittent starts over scattered millennia. Awakening to a galaxy riven by war, not unlike the one they had hoped to leave behind. The Eldari were but a fraction of themselves, but newer threats had emerged from every corner of the galaxy, namely the Imperium of Man. But the Necrons are an immortal, undying empire, their technology still unmatched by any star-faring civilization, and time is always on their side.